Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of Robotina, where the Russians have restarted offensive operations into the village. It's reported that they're attacking here from the western side into the village. This is happening after the Russians managed to recapture the Surovikin line, and now fighting is taking place here on the eastern and western side of Robotina, where the Russians are trying to capture the fortifications here to the east of the village, while at the same time fighting within the village itself. These new developments indicate that the Russians are likely gunning for the northern fortifications, considering they're attacking from the western side without attacking the southern side first, and at the same time with the fighting on the eastern side, this could be to split up the Ukrainian forces defending the village, attacking both at the same time. It is reported that the current strategy of the Russians in the area, or throughout the front line really in general, is that they launch attacks in areas until the Ukrainians send reinforcements to the area, and then they switch to a different area. This has happened with Novomikhailivka, Krasnohorivka, Pervomaiske, west of Avdiivka, in the northern parts by Sinkivka and Belorivka, and in the south with Robotina. So the Russians started attacking in the direction of Robotina, then they switched their attention to the west of Avdiivka, then they switched to Novomikhailivka and Krasnohorivka, and then they restarted operations in Robotina again. It is a classic hit and run strategy, except that compared to the normal strategy where the Russians would be moving its own troops to one part and then moving it to a different part to start attacks there, instead what is happening is that the Russians simply have units by the front line, and whether or not they engage in active operations is simply them switching off between active and passive, so that when the Ukrainian reinforcements arrive, they withdraw from their positions and they stop attacking, and then the Ukrainian forces are to be sent elsewhere, then they start attacking again once they leave. The objective of this operation or strategy is two things. The first one is to keep the Ukrainian army on the move, which would tire them out and make it difficult for them to continuously fight, because they are using a lot of energy on the movement itself rather than the fighting. The second objective is to keep the Ukrainians on the offensive. What is meant by that is when the Russians attack Robotina, then they pull out of it. The Ukrainians will launch a counterattack to recapture the positions, and during those counterattacks, the Russians will bombard the whole area with a lot of artillery, which would cause casualties on the Ukrainian side. So what they're gunning for is to force the Ukrainians to send their troops, because if they don't send their troops, then they'll lose the area. And once the troops arrive, they've just been moving around, and then they have to now counterattack to recapture these positions. And during those counterattacks, they are getting shelled heavily by the Russians. So to explain this strategy in the simplest of terms, it is to prevent the Ukrainians from holding a break, preventing them from pausing. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the south of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have now captured the fortifications to the south of the city, and with this, the Russians will now likely capture the areas here to the south of the railways, considering that they have gotten control over the fortifications. So with this, the Russians are now able to launch multiple operations. The first one is to gain control over the residential area here to the south of the city, as well as flanking the Ukrainian fortifications here to the east, which would allow the Russians to connect these fortifications or positions here to the east of Krasnohorivka. The fighting will likely also continue into the trenches here to the east of Krasnohorivka, where the Russians would be able to attack them from the flank, which would mean that it would be trench-on-trench fighting face-to-face between soldiers, instead of the Russians actually storming trenches here to the east based on. The biggest difference here is that the Russians would, of course, be under artillery fire as per normal, but the difference is that the Ukrainian positions within these trenches will not be able to have a direct sight on the Russians coming from the east, because there would be no one coming from the east, but instead be coming from the south in the cover of the forest line and moving through the trenches, which would even out the playing field for both sides, except that the ones defending still have an advantage over the one attacking. We also have this footage here, which was geolocated by Ryber, which shows FAB 1500s dropping into Krasnohorivka, and this is one of the main reasons that the Russians are able to advance, is the constant bombardment of Ukrainian positions here throughout the city. Moving on to the next part of the front line, we see here in the direction of Pervomaiske, the Russians made a small advancement here to the center between the northern and central parts of Pervomaiske, as they are connecting the two sides between the north and the south to allow them to start storming the central part and final parts of Pervomaiske before the battle of the town ends and they move on to Nitailove here to the west. Again, this is something where we see the Russians started attacking here 4 days ago, and since then there have been these small advances over the past 3 days. But we do not see any developments in Nevelske since they did that late February. So they moved from attacking in the direction of Nevelske to then attacking the direction of Pervomaiske. All of this is to keep the Ukrainian army on the move and not settle down in any of the areas. As soon as they settle down, they'll dig in and the Russians will have a much more difficult time to advance. So instead, they are trying to prevent the Ukrainians from doing so by constantly being on the move, by attacking different areas with their numerical superiority in these local areas. The reason why the Russians are able to have numerical superiority in local areas, despite the even amount of soldiers on both sides, is mainly due to the Ukrainians concentrating a lot of forces here in the area west of Avdiivka, where the Russians report that the Ukrainians currently outnumber them with over 2-1. Yet we still see the Russians launching this flanking maneuver from Orlivka down to Tonenke, where they're looking to cut off the Ukrainian supply lines and attacking them from the flank. This will likely be combined with an assault from the south to cut off the supply lines there. And with this, we're seeing that the Russians are looking to gain full control over Tonenke with this assault. At the same time, fighting continues here in the western parts of the village of Orlivka, as well as here in Berdychi, where there is this footage here which shows some Russian drones hitting Ukrainian Bradleys, and in the end we have 3 Bradleys stuck, either disabled or destroyed, right next to the cemetery. So this could be the second Bradley cemetery forming here in the west of Berdychi. So far we've seen 4 Bradley losses and 3 Abrams losses here by Berdychi, as well as 1 M1150 mine-clearing armored vehicle based on the Abrams chassis. Now, based on this footage here, we see a Russian drone hitting some of these Bradleys that were abandoned here to the west of Berdychi after being disabled. With this geolocated footage, we confirm where the area of the video is taking place. And with this, we see that there is confirmation that the Ukrainians are taking some armored losses, trying to recapture Berdychi, as the Russians are holding on to their positions within the village to prevent the Ukrainians from pushing them out. So heavy fighting is taking place here by Berdychi, and we'll have to see how much the Ukrainians are able to recapture, or if the Russians will restart offensive operations here in the north to capture the village. As mentioned, we see that the Russians are being pressured most heavily here in the direction of Berdychi, where the Ukrainians are completely trying to recapture it with their best units and their best vehicles, yet they are facing a lot of difficulties doing so. I predicted that this would be the main area of fighting between these 3 villages due to the fact that Berdychi itself is located on the heights similar to Semenivka, while Orlivka and Tonenke are on the lower grounds. This means that if the Russians capture Berdychi, they can move on to Semenivka without having to face through the heights. And at the same time, we see that the fortifications by Semenivka are pointed towards dealing with the Russians if they were to fight from the low grounds and not from the northern parts where the fortifications are weaker. So we're seeing that these developments indicate that the Ukrainians are heavily fighting over Berdychi because that is the most important area to fight over, and the Russians are trying to gain further control of it and hold their positions as the fighting continues. We move further north here in the direction of Bilorivka, where the Russians have managed to gain control over this hill right here to the east of the village, and with this the Russians now have full control over all of the heights to the east of Bilorivka. Now the Ukrainians still have 3 positions here to the west, which are all located in the heights, both to the north and to the west of Bilorivka. These 3 areas here, all of them are positions that the Ukrainians are building the fortifications on and holding the positions on to oversee the village itself. The village itself is located on the low grounds. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians have any positions within the village itself. They're instead located on the heights to the west of the village. And with this, we see that it is now an area where the village itself is split into 2. The Russians control the heights on the east and the Ukrainians the heights on the west. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.